Okay, welcome to the neural basis of learning. All right, so basically what we're looking at now is very similar to the stuff that we did with memory. Okay, and we're looking at the role that the neurons play and that the brain plays when we are learning something. Okay, so there's going to be some stuff here that it sounds very familiar and hopefully reminds you a lot about the stuff that we did in memory. Okay. Overall, what we're looking at here throughout these little topics that we're going to be talking about is ways that the brain makes it easier or more streamlined to get important information around our brain. Okay, so once you learn something, your body and your brain then realizes it has to keep that information and make it quicker for that information to travel from your brain to your hands or whatever in order for you to complete the performance or the action. Okay, like doing your times tables or writing with a pencil or whatever. So, the neural basis of learning, which is where the brain follows predictable patterns of development and growth. Okay, neurons change size, shape, function, and change connections. Okay, this is a very biological psychology. Okay, so imagine the guys in lab coats spending all their time in a laboratory cutting open and dissecting brains. This is the kind of area that we're looking at. So, just to go back to what a neuron is, this is stuff we learned in term 2. We're looking here at the neuron. You can see there at the top the dendrites, the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminals or the axon buttons. Alright, remember that it is an electrical impulse that travels through the neuron, and it is a chemical impulse that travels between neurons. Okay? And you can see that here. When the message gets to the synapse, which is that area there, that circled area there, okay, the neuron sends messages across the synaptic gap chemically using neurotransmitters. There are a couple of neurotransmitters that we're going to need to know. We'll get to that later on. You have the presynaptic neuron, which is the neuron that's sending the information, and you have a postsynaptic neuron, which is receiving the information. Okay? So, just to be very clear, information comes through the presynaptic neuron in electrical form. Then when it hits the synapse, okay, it turns to chemical form where neurotransmitters are sent across the synaptic gap, which is then picked up by the postsynaptic neuron on receivers, okay, and in the dendrites, and then sent through that neuron. And you can see that here. Okay, you can see that the message, or the direction of the message as it comes through the dendrites at the top, through the cell body, through the axon, into the axon terminals, and connects there at the synapses in that red circle. Okay, the synapse, and the dendrites of another neuron pick that up. The most famous psychologist or biologist to really get a hold of this information was Donald Hebb. Okay, and he found that during learning, new synapses and neural pathways are formed. Okay, and that the strength of an existing neural pathways and connections between neurons at the synapse can be increased. Very similar to the, remember the slug that was done by Candle, where neurons that had lots of information that kept talking to each other strengthened. This is the same deal. His little catchphrase was, neurons that fire together wire together. So if you are so think about the first time you got your iPhone or your touch phone and you had to text using that, okay? Initially, and your parents are probably still the same, they press the buttons like this, okay? Whereas you can actually just use your thumb and very quickly move from letter to letter. Okay, that's because the neurons that go from your brain down to your thumb or down to your fingers have wired together. Okay, they've created a streamlined highway so that information goes from your brain to your thumb really, really quickly. And that's due to a process called long-term potentiation. We talked about this in memory, okay? And this is where the synaptic changes are said to have long-term potentiation, long-lasting strengthening of synaptic connections of neurons, leading to enhanced function of the neurons when activated. Basically, turns your neuronal pathways into superhighways. Okay, it's called long-term potentiation. They connect together, they increase axons and dendrites, they increase neurotransmitters, and they basically allow the information to run from your brain to your thumb super quick. Okay, this is crucial. This idea of long-term potentiation is crucial to learning. How do we know that some of this works? Well, we know that the advantage of having long-term potentiation and the role of the hippocampus, you might remember that for memory as well, okay, helps with memory. It also helps with learning, all right? How do we know this? Well, a famous study done, and it's in your textbook on page 432, okay? Basically, there was a group of rats, okay, and this was a study done by Richard Morris and his colleagues. Study of rats, they had three groups. First group had frontal lobe damage. Second group had hippocampus damage, and the third group had no damage. And basically what they had to do is they put them in a big bowl with milky water so you couldn't see anything, and at some place in the maze there was a little platform. So they put the rat in the water and it would swim around. It didn't want to drown. It was trying to find a way out, and it eventually would bump into the platform. Now, as they put the rats in all the time, eventually through trial and error learning, the rats would remember where the platform was, so they didn't feel uncomfortable or didn't feel like they were going to drown. So let's have a look at their results. Over time, you can see there, Group A, which had some frontal lobe damage, found a pretty streamlined way. That was the average pathway that was recorded. That was the average pathway, and over time it was found to be, they got the hang of it. Even though they had no frontal lobe, they figured out a pretty streamlined way to get to the finish of the maze. Group C, the same. They were normal, so there wasn't too much difference between not having a frontal lobe or having a frontal lobe. The big difference was if you didn't have a hippocampus, you couldn't create long-term potentiation. You can see group 2 in the middle, they were all over the place. They didn't have any memory, they didn't have any sign that they had learned where the platform was. Okay, which shows us the role that the hippocampus plays in not only memory but also in being able to learn. So, it's important to remember that the areas of the brain and the neurons that are going to help us with learning are not too dissimilar from the areas of the brain connected with memory. So we have within the neuron, very important, we have the synapse, which is where the chemical interactions happen. Presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron, and the bit in the middle is the synaptic gap. What happens in that synaptic gap? Well, that's a release of neurotransmitters. Glutamate, which you can see there, is one of the most common neurotransmitters that is connected with learning. Okay, it's very important that we remember glutamate and dopamine that are strongly connected with learning, and these are released when learning occurs and increased when an action has been learned. Okay, so the release of glutamate and dopamine are increased, and that shows us that there is some level of learning occurring. Also, to do with the memory side of things, you might remember this where we look at acetylcholine, okay, but not as important as glutamate and dopamine. But the parts of the brain, this is important, and I've pinched this from Tutor on Demand, and if you use the Tutor on Demand video, it's a great little video on this. It's condensed and it's pretty easy to follow. But the amygdala, basically this is really doesn't involve any conscious thought here, and this is the classical conditioning stuff. So the amygdala is responsible for the fight and flight response, okay, and so it's kind of based on emotion. So the fear response comes from classical conditioning. The hippocampus is involved in spatial learning. You can remember the rats, and also the creation of long-term potentiation. We also have another area called the ventral tegmental area. Sounds pretty fancy, but you can just call it the VTA. This is the area associated with learning through reward, okay, and if we know learning through rewards is all about operant conditioning. Finally, the area called the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. These parts of the brain are to do with, well, the cerebellum is movement, and also the cerebral cortex is more higher order thinking. Hard to kind of fit this into a gap here, but the lady who does Tutor on Demand, she seems to think that learning any sort of movement sequences, especially through observational learning, and any sort of higher order stuff which requires attention and being really active as a learner, that will come through observational learning. Okay, so the observational learning is strongly connected to the cerebral cortex, definitely, and to a degree cerebellum. All right. She also makes a point down here that, remember, brain imaging techniques can also be tested in Unit 4 as well as Unit 3. So please make sure that you remember that. I'm going to talk about that at the end of this video as well. This brings us to plasticity, okay, which is, can't think of an easy way to say this apart from the brain is a bit like plastic, or it's a bit like Play-Doh, okay, plasticine. Basically, you can mold it, you can change it, it will adapt, and that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about adaptability. So the ability of the brain's neural structures or functions to be changed by experience. Okay, neural pathways and connections are constantly changing through new experiences. Every time you have new experiences, especially if you learn something, then you'll see a change in the structure of the brain. Okay, not a big, massive change, but a subtle change. Okay, this is what makes learning and memory possible and allows us to adapt to our changing environment. You will know if you do some extra reading that some areas of the brain are more plastic than others. Okay, and sometimes in our life, our brains are more plastic than other times in our lives. All right, that's why you hear things like children develop so much, or most of their learning is done by the time they're age of 5, or the best time to teach a kid a language is when they're 4 years old. Okay, children's brains show greater plasticity than adults, and this is why they can learn languages and all those kinds of things. All right. Also, the more complex the experience, the more complex the change. How do we know some of this stuff? Well, Rosenzweig did a study with lab rats, where basically got a whole bunch of little lab rats, which I found out the other day are the baby rats are called pups, which I thought was kind of cute. So a whole bunch of baby rats and put them in different types of environments. All right. So the first one was you had a standard environment, which there was like a cage with a couple of rats in it and food and water. The second type was what he called impoverished environment, which was just one cage, one rat, some food and some water. And then there was the enriched environment, or what I like to call the party house environment, which is where they had heaps of stuff going on. There was wheels, there was puzzles, there was ladders, there was food, there was all sorts of stuff. You know, they probably had foxtail, I'm not sure. But you can imagine it. It was a cool place to live. All right, it was like a university house. And so we had these 3 different types of environments, which meant 3 different types of experiences. So what did we find out? Basically, once the rats had been in there for 80 days, they were all killed off, which is a sad story. But they dissected their brains to find that the rats, surprise, surprise, who had the most enriched experience had thicker, heavier cerebral cortexes. Okay, so their brains were bigger, their brains had more neuronal connections because they were doing more stuff. It makes sense. All right, so usually this happens naturally. Okay, we have something called developmental plasticity. All right, and it happens over time, and it happens at different stages, but it happens across our whole lives. And you guys are right in the thick of a really big time of developmental plasticity. There are a couple of stages. Okay, we have what's called proliferation, right, which usually happens when you're a baby or a feed, like really young, which is when all of your neurons grow. You grow all the neurons that you need. Okay, thousands of them, heaps, thousands and thousands of them. Then what happens is, as you develop when you're really, really young, so from 0 to 2 or whatever, what happens is those neurons start to go out. They start to migrate, like birds migrate, like any animals migrate. They start to go where they're needed or where they want to go. Okay, they go down the body, they go in, all the way into the tips of your fingers, all the way down to the tips of your toes. Okay, so that's the migration. What happens is once they've migrated, then they start to create circuit formation. And this is that synaptogenesis, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. Okay, synaptogenesis. And this is basically where they start to connect. Right? Remember, those that fire together wire together. If you start moving on your feet, moving your legs, more of those connections are going to come down together and start to connect. The next bit that happens is once you have a lot of this circuit formation, you start to have what they call circuit pruning, which is a crazy little thing where if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So if you once, 100 years ago, maybe not 100 years ago, but when you were little, you started to learn a language, okay, and then you stopped using that language, then if you stop using it, your brain will say, oh, we don't really need those connections anymore, let's cut them back. Okay, because we want to send all the neurons and the dendrites and the axons to the pathways that we use the most all the time. Okay, so that's an important process that you need to know. And then finally, they have the process of myelination, which is where there's a coating starts to create across the neurons, okay, called myelin sheath. And once myelination has occurred, again, it creates a superhighway. It means that the message can travel faster. Here's that word that I was trying to say before, synaptogenesis, which means forming new neural connections. Genesis, for those people who may have knowledge of the Old Testament, Genesis is the creation story that God created everything in 6 days. Okay, and so Genesis meaning creation or birth. All right, so we have, especially in the early years, rapid in the early years to allow the brain to deal with all types of new sensory information. So the first time the baby opens its eyes, all this light comes in. That means all the neurons have to be formed, bang, ready to go to interpret that neuron, that environmental stimulus. Again, there you can see the definition of pruning, which is they cut off the stuff they don't need. And interestingly enough, adults have 40% less neural connections than a 3-year-old. Here's what it looks like. Your neural connections at birth, there's hardly any neural connections there. They've all migrated out, they've all moved out to the suburbs, but they haven't built any roads yet. Then at 6, you've done so much learning, making all those connections, all those networks, okay? Then, by the time you're about 14, you realize you don't need that many connections, okay? So it starts to prune, it starts to cut them down, all right? We also, remember I talked before about there are certain times that your brain is more plastic than others. This is one of them. Sensitive periods when an organism is more responsive to a certain stimulation. Okay, for example, babies are really young. If you're not exposed to language by about 5, it's really, really hard to acquire proper language after that. And there's some studies on the internet you can see about those things. But kids that are locked in a room till they're 5 and they don't speak to anybody, or they don't really hear anybody talking, okay, they really, really struggle to ever speak properly, and they usually don't speak properly. Okay, there's also the definition there, which is where a closed eye from birth can lead to later blindness. Okay, eventually when the eyes open, because those neurons haven't formed. All right, it's very difficult. Language acquisition has a sensitive period of 0 to 12. Okay, so you can probably learn a couple of different languages during that stage. It's probably best to. And also we have the experience expectant, which is a developmental process where there is an increase in neural connection at a certain stage just before you start to prepare for a certain type of experience, okay, in those sensitive periods. So for example, the best possible time to learn if learning doesn't occur during sensitive period. So these sensitive periods are the best time to learn. It's when your body is ripe for learning. Okay, if you don't learn something during that period, it can be more difficult to learn it later on, and you probably won't be as successful. That's what I was talking about with the language. Okay. Also, the brains of university graduates have approximately 40% more neural connections than those who leave school early. Why am I telling you that? Because I don't want you to leave school early. Make sure you go on and keep learning, because the more you learn, the more your brain continues to grow. We're not 100% sure yet when. They say sometimes another sensitive period is now between about 15 and 21. So really continuing to learn during that period is really important for your development. And we know this because of twin studies. Adaptive plasticity. Okay, so we have developmental plasticity, which is pretty easy to understand. Basically, adaptive plasticity is if something goes wrong in the brain, can other parts of the brain compensate? Can they make up for it? Right? If there's damage to the brain, or if the brain has have to be changed in some way. So, for example, You can read those there. But the most, people like HM who had parts of their brain taken out. Sometimes they can adapt, sometimes they can't. There's a video which I've posted later, just the link, not the whole video, which talks about a young girl who had epilepsy. They took out one whole half of her brain. She was still was able to recover really, really well. Not do everything, but do a lot of things that she wouldn't possibly be able to do. Okay? And there's the link just there. So when you have damage to the brain, two processes occur. There's rerouting, which is sometimes when neurons that already exist can start to make new connections. Okay, and then there is also the sprouting, which is where neurons grow new bushier nerve fibers. That one doesn't happen as often as the rerouting one. And again here it says enables new neural connections to compensate for loss of function from brain damage. Alright, and this brings me to this slide here where I want to talk to you very quickly about they can still test you in this exam on your understanding of imaging technology, PET scans, SPECT scans, and functional MRIs. Alright, we know that these things measure blood flow, especially the fMRI, more oxygenated blood equals more active. Right? Why is this important? Well, because they usually will show scans from before someone has learned something and after someone has learned something. An increased blood flow to a certain area will show that kind of increase in neuronal connections. Okay, that's really important. Okay, for example, you have scans that you can also have scans that compare individuals. So musicians, because they spend a large time listening and creating music, they have larger temporal lobes. Okay, taxi drivers, because they spend a large time creating mental maps, they have larger parietal lobes, and dancers, because they have such great control over their body, they have larger motor areas. So please remember to go back and revisit what a PET scan is, what a SPECT scan is, what an fMRI scan is. You probably won't need to know CAT scan too much. It's the ones that show actual movement in the brain. So PET scan, SPECT scan, and fMRI. What do they do and how might they be used? Okay, that's plasticity. That's the neuronal influence on learning. Remember, it's functional changes and structural changes. You need to know the difference. Okay, and we'll do some work around that. Also about plasticity in the brain as well. So what does plasticity mean and how does the brain change when we learn something? Okay, quick video today. I hope you got some out of it. And remember, if you're a bit stuck, also watch the lady from Tutor on Demand. Thanks very much. Bye.